She was 40 years old, and by the summer of 1886 she had nothing left in the world but a mourning dress gone dull from washing, a small trunk of her late husband's tools, and $4 pressed flat inside her Bible. Her name was Constance Whitfield, and it was the elders of her own late husband's church, led by a stern deacon named Ezra Coldwell, who had long resented her husband's quiet independence from the county's larger congregation, who had informed her within a month of the burial that the parsonage was needed for the new minister's family and that a widow with no children had no further claim upon it. She took what little she could carry and traveled south into the Texas Hill Country, to a town called Palo Seco, where a burnt-out chapel at the edge of town, gutted by a fire 9 years before and never rebuilt, was being sold by the county for $4 simply to clear its name from the tax rolls. Nobody else wanted it. She paid the $4, and the men gathered at the land office laughed and said a widow buying a ruin of burnt timber, and that was surely the saddest bargain Palo Seco had seen in years. What none of them knew, what Constance herself did not yet know as she pushed through that scorched doorway for the first time, was that somewhere within those blackened walls stood a locked cell that had been sealed away for 9 long years, holding inside it a secret that would not only save her from ruin but would return to the whole of Palo Seco a truth it had buried alongside its own ashes. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Constance Whitfield. If you have ever been told that a burned, broken thing was beyond saving, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Constance had been born Constance Merrick in 1846 on a small farm outside Nashville, Tennessee, the eldest daughter of a stonemason named Josiah Merrick, a quiet, exacting man who built church foundations and courthouse steps across 3 counties, and who raised his daughter, in the absence of any sons, to understand stone and mortar with the same seriousness most fathers reserve for teaching a boy a trade. Josiah believed that a structure built honestly would outlast any structure built quickly, and he taught Constance to read the bones of building the way other girls were taught to read music, showing her how to judge whether the foundation had settled true, how to recognize a particular weakness in mortar mixed too thin, how to understand that a building's outward appearance often told you far less than its hidden framework did. It was a peculiar education for a girl of that era, and her mother worried aloud, more than once, that such knowledge would save Constance little in the parlor, but Josiah simply replied that a woman who understood how things were built would never be easily deceived by anything that merely looked sound, a lesson Constance carried with her long after she had any occasion to lay stone herself. At 22, Constance married a young circuit-riding minister named Thomas Whitfield, a gentle, principled man who had come through Nashville preaching at a revival meeting, and who found in Constance a partner whose practical steadiness matched his own spiritual conviction. Thomas was not a man who sought comfortable congregations or easy postings, and within 2 years of their marriage he had accepted a calling to serve the scattered, struggling communities of the Texas Hill Country, settling eventually in the small town of Palo Seco, where he built, with his own hands and the help of a dozen willing families, a modest wooden chapel that became, for over a decade, the true heart of that isolated community. Constance worked alongside her husband in every practical sense, keeping the chapel's few records, tending to families in illness, and quietly overseeing the building's maintenance with the same careful eye her father had taught her, noticing and repairing small weaknesses in the structure long before they became serious problems. A stewardship that went largely unremarked upon by the congregation, but which Thomas himself deeply valued, and often credited for the chapel's long soundness. They never had children, a sorrow Constance carried privately through all their years together, and instead she poured her attention into the chapel and its people, coming to know every family in Palo Seco by name and circumstance, the widow who needed extra flour in winter, the rancher's son struggling to read, the whole quiet fabric of a small frontier congregation held together as much by Constance's practical care as by Thomas's sermons. It was in the winter of 1877 that disaster first struck Palo Seco's chapel, when a fire, begun by an overturned lamp during a particularly bitter cold snap, swept through the building in the small hours of a January night and left little standing but its stone foundation and a portion of one blackened wall. No one was harmed, for the fire began after the building had emptied for the evening, but the chapel itself was declared a total loss, and Thomas, already aging and increasingly troubled by a weakness in his lungs that the damp winter had worsened, found himself without the strength or the resources to rebuild what had taken him a decade to establish. The larger county congregation, based in the county seat and overseen by a council of deacons that included the ambitious young Ezra Caldwell, offered Thomas a modest pension and a small parsonage on condition that he formally dissolve the independent Palo Seco congregation and direct its remaining families to travel instead to the county church, an arrangement Thomas accepted reluctantly, understanding he had little choice given his failing health, though it grieved him deeply to abandon the chapel he had built. He lived another 8 years in that arrangement, growing steadily weaker, and Constance nursed him faithfully through his long decline until his death in the spring of 1886, at which point Ezra Caldwell, who had by then risen to a position of considerable influence within the county congregation, moved swiftly to reclaim the parsonage for the incoming minister's family. Constance did not argue when Ezra Caldwell informed her of the congregation's decision, understanding, much as her father had once taught her about foundations, that a structure of authority already settled against her would not shift simply because she pressed against it. She packed her husband's few remaining tools, the modest trunk of books and papers he had kept, and the $4 that constituted the whole of her savings, and she traveled a short distance back to Palo Seco itself, the town where she had spent the happiest years of her marriage, though she had no clear plan beyond a stubborn wish to see the old chapel's ruin one final time before deciding where her life might go from there. It was while making inquiries at the small land office regarding lodging that she learned the burned chapel's lot, still technically county property after 9 years of standing derelict, was finally being cleared from the tax rolls, offered to anyone willing to assume the modest back taxes owed against it, a sum that came to exactly $4. Constance offered the money before she had fully considered the decision, moved by something she could not entirely name, a stubborn loyalty to the building her husband had raised with his own hands, and the clerk, eager to be rid of the property, processed the transaction without much ceremony, though several men waiting nearby remarked, not unkindly but with evident amusement, that the minister's widow had gone and bought herself a pile of ash and burnt timber worth considerably less than what she'd paid. She walked out to the chapel that same afternoon, finding it much as 9 years of weather and neglect had left it, the roof entirely gone, most of the wooden walls collapsed into blackened, weather-softened timber. But the original stone foundation, the very foundation her father's teachings had helped her recognize as remarkably sound weight, still standing solid beneath the wreckage, along with a portion of the chapel's rear stone wall that had somehow survived the fire nearly intact. Constance spent her first days simply clearing debris, and it was on her third day, while working to clear collapsed timber away from that surviving rear wall, that she noticed something her father's training made her unable to ignore, a section of the stone wall whose mortar joints did not quite match the pattern of the rest, subtly but unmistakably different in their spacing and texture, the kind of irregularity that told her, with quiet certainty, that this portion of wall had been built or modified separately from the original construction. She worked at the suspicious section with a small chisel over the following 2 days, and on the third, the stones gave way to reveal not solid foundation behind them, but a narrow, hidden chamber built into the thickness of the wall itself, a space perhaps 4 feet square, sealed originally, she realized with growing astonishment, behind an iron-barred door that had been mortared over and concealed so thoroughly that no trace of it showed from the chapel's interior at all. The door itself was locked, its iron latch rusted but intact, and it took her the better part of a week, working patiently with tools from her husband's old trunk, to finally force the ancient lock and swing that heavy door open on hinges that grown with 9 years of stillness, revealing within the small chamber a modest iron bed frame long since collapsed, a rusted water pail, and, wrapped carefully in oiled leather that had somehow survived both the fire above and nearly a decade of exposure, a bundle of papers that would append everything Constance believed she understood about her late husband's quiet chapel. She carried the bundle to a patch of clear ground outside and untied it with careful, trembling hands, and what she found within was not, as she might have feared, any dark secret of her husband's own making, but rather a set of documents belonging to a man neither she nor Thomas had ever spoken of, a runaway named Elias Freeman, whose careful, halting handwriting recorded, across several pages, an account of his time hidden within that very chamber during the final years before the war, when Thomas's predecessor at the chapel, a minister named Reverend Aldous Pratt, whom Constance knew only as a name in the chapel's old records, had apparently used the hidden cell as a station along a secret route helping enslaved people reach freedom further north and west, concealing them within the sealed chamber whenever slave catchers or suspicious travelers passed through Palo Seco. Elias Freeman's account, written some years after his own escape when he had achieved his freedom and remarkably, learned to read and write with real fluency, had been sent back to Reverend Pratt as a gift and a testimony, along with a small return payment of gold coin enclosed in gratitude, a debt Elias insisted on repaying, though Pratt had asked for nothing. And Pratt had apparently kept both the letter and the coin sealed within the very chamber that had once hidden Elias himself, perhaps, as a private memorial to a chapter of the chapel's history too dangerous to speak of openly even years after the war's end. Constance sat with those papers long into the evening, the ruined chapel silent around her, and felt the whole of her understanding of her husband's ministry shift and deepen at once. She had known, vaguely, that Reverend Pratt had served the Palo Seco congregation before Thomas, but Thomas himself, she now realized, must never have known the full history hidden within his own chapel's walls, for surely he would have told her of it, would have treated that sealed chamber with reverence rather than simply building his church atop it unknowing. The gold coin, when she counted it, amounted to a modest but genuinely useful sum, and included among the papers was a final note in Reverend Pratt's own hand, dated shortly before his death, explaining that he had chosen to seal the chamber rather than expose it, fearing that even years after the war, revealing the full extent of what had happened within those walls might draw unwelcome trouble to a congregation still finding its footing in a region where old loyalties and resentment had not entirely faded, but expressing his hope that someday, when the time was right, whoever discovered this record would understand its significance and see that Elias Freeman's story and the chapel's quiet courage in protecting him was properly honored rather than left forgotten in ash and stone. It did not take Constance long to understand that not everyone in Palo Seco would welcome such a story being brought into the light. When she began making careful, respectful inquiries among the town's older families, seeking anyone who might remember Reverend Pratt's era or confirm details of the chapel's early history, she found that a considerable portion of the town's founding families whose fortunes had been built in no small part on plantation land and enslaved labor before the war, still held to old resentments regarding the abolition movement and its sympathizers, and Ezra Caldwell himself, she soon learned, was the grandson of one such family, a man who had built his own standing within the county congregation partly through careful cultivation of the older, more conservative family's continued influence and financial support. Ezra came to Palo Seco himself within the week, having heard through the small town's inevitable gossip that the minister's widow was digging through the burned chapel's ruins and asking pointed questions about its earliest history, and he found her at the chapel with an expression of controlled displeasure that Constance had rarely seen him display so openly. He suggested, in a tone she recognized as carefully measured, that whatever old papers she believed she had found was surely of little consequence after so many years, and that stirring up old, painful history regarding the war and its causes would serve no one well in a town still working to hold itself together across old divisions. When Constance did not immediately yield, his tone grew firmer, and he reminded her plainly that the county congregation continued goodwill, and any small charitable consideration they might extend to a widow with no other resources depended a great deal on her willingness to let matters of the past remain settled rather than reopened. Constance thanked him for his visit with more composure than she entirely felt, understanding clearly the implicit threat beneath his careful words, and after he left she sat for a long while considering what she owed, not to Ezra Caldwell's comfort, but to Elias Freeman's own carefully preserved testimony, a man who had trusted that his story would someday be honored rather than kept buried a second time by a different generation's discomfort. She did not act rashly, understanding, as her father had once taught her about foundations, that a claim built on solid, verifiable ground would withstand far more pressure than one built on assertion alone. She wrote first to the State Historical Society in Austin, describing what she had found and requesting guidance on verifying and properly preserving such a document, and received in reply genuine and immediate interest from a young archivist named Miss Beatrice Wren, who traveled to Palo Seco herself within a month to examine Elias Freeman's account firsthand and confirmed, through careful cross-referencing with surviving abolitionist correspondence networks and Underground Railroad records, held in Northern archives, that Elias Freeman had indeed been a documented figure, his eventual freedom and later life as a respected tradesman in Ohio a matter of established record, lending powerful, independent corroboration to the account Constance had found sealed within the chapel wall. Miss Wren's involvement, and the State Historical Society's evident interest in properly documenting and preserving what she confirmed was a genuinely significant piece of Texas history, made it considerably more difficult for Ezra Caldwell or anyone else in Palo Seco to simply dismiss or suppress the discovery, and word of the find began, gradually, to spread beyond the county congregation's careful control. Rather than seeking any confrontation with Ezra Caldwell directly, Constance chose instead to let the truth itself do the work, inviting the town families, all of them, regardless of old loyalties, to a public gathering at the chapel ruins where Miss Wren herself spoke about the historical significance of what had been found, reading portions of Elias Freeman's own account in his own carefully preserved words, describing the fear and the courage of those years with a plain, dignified clarity that left even some of the town's more conservative old families visibly moved. Ezra Caldwell did not attend, and in the weeks that followed, as the discovery drew modest but genuine attention from newspapers as far as Austin and Houston, his continued influence within the county congregation began to erode, several of the congregation's own members expressing quiet discomfort that their deacon had apparently attempted to suppress and dismiss a piece of the region's history rather than see it properly honored. Within the year, Ezra Caldwell stepped down from his position, citing personal reasons, and relocated to a different county entirely. And though Constance took no particular satisfaction in his departure, she recognized in it a quiet, unforced justice, a man whose own comfort had depended on old silences finding that silence no longer available to him once the truth had been properly and publicly set free. With the modest gold recovered from the hidden chamber and, in time, a small grant from the State Historical Society interested in preserving the site properly, Constance rebuilt the chapel not merely as a place of worship, but as a monument to the very history it had once concealed, restoring the original stone foundation her father's teachings had first drawn her attention to, and preserving the hidden chamber itself, no longer sealed but openly marked and explained, as a permanent memorial to Elias Freeman and to Reverend Pratt's quiet courage. It is worth remembering, now, how this story began. A widow of 40, cast out with $4, buying for that same small sum a burned ruin that the whole town believed was worth nothing but its ashes. Constance Whitfield never forgot the laughter that followed her from the land office, and she never forgot, either, her father's patient lessons about foundations, that the truest strength of any structure lies not in what shows on its surface, but in what has been built carefully, honestly, into its hidden bones. Reverend Pratt had sealed his chamber not out of shame, but out of a caution he hoped would someday no longer be necessary, and Constance had honored that hope not by keeping Elias Freeman's story for herself, but by returning it, fully and publicly, to a town that needed, whether it welcomed the reminder or not, to remember the whole of its own history. What waited behind that locked cell did shock the whole of Palo Seco, not merely because it revealed a secret 9 years buried, but because it returned to that town a truth about its own quiet courage that had been sealed away for far longer than anyone had realized, waiting patiently in stone for someone willing to look closely enough to find it. Thank you for spending this time with Constance Whitfield in the town of Palo Seco tonight. If her story moved you, we hope you will share it with someone who needs reminding that even what has been burned to ash can still hold, within its foundation, something worth rebuilding. We would love to know, in the comment below, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off as ruined? Take care of one another, and take care of the quiet, overlooked histories that still deserve to be told. Until next time, stay close.